Hello and welcome back to Vermont Film Essentials. My name is David Metzger.
I'm Devon Ewalt.
We are here to discuss Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, and both of us need to be careful because there's a lot to talk about with this one, so we want to make sure we get a lot in. I'll just start. So my love affair, and I'm not being facetious, my love affair with Billy Wilder started, so 1999, American Beauty won Best Picture. And so first, Kevin Spacey got up and said his performance was inspired by Jack Lemmon in The Apartment.
Okay.
And then when Sam Mendes got up to get Best Director, he said that, I dedicate this to the work of Billy Wilder, which was influential to us making this film. And he specifically said The Apartment, but then he said, and also Sunset Boulevard.
Oh, I mean, it's the first thing I thought when the movie started. This is being narrated by a dead man.
Yeah.
Like, come on. I mean, that's just like,
And there's no, that just started, I was like, okay, I'll watch The Apartment. I watched The Apartment and I'm like, wow.
Yeah, I can't wait to do that again with that in mind. That's great.
And then it started down a rabbit hole. So I did The Apartment. I think I went to Some Like It Hot.
So
then I went to Sunset Boulevard, and I just kept going.
Double Indemnity. I mean,
Double Indemnity.
It just doesn't end.
And then, not a year after, I was also back in those younger days. I loved Cameron Crowe before he broke my heart, and then. So he came out with this book, and I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe, it was just like a serendipitous thing. And I just kept, no matter how further I went with his filmography, it was just like one gem after the other.
He can almost do no wrong. I mean, it's only towards his later films that I detected a formula.
Yeah.
Like The Front Page and Avanti. Like, as much as I wanted to like some of these films, there were flaws, but at the same time, they were still entertaining. I mean, even his lesser films are better than a lot of people's best films. And
even to go back and say, this guy, he co-wrote Ninotchka. He co-wrote Ball of Fire, which was directed by Howard Hawks.
He wrote pretty much every film he made. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Considering the writing in this film, it's pretty amazing. And the collaboration between him and Brackett and just what was achieved,
And especially going into college, falling in love with screenwriting and having this book at my, having this as a Bible.
Of course.
And really kind of breaking down most of his screenplays. It was I respected him so much because he was a writer first. It seemed like he didn't, his style was dictated by the script. So it's not like he went around and said, I want to make a film noir. And
it seems like he's a guy who trusted his cinematographer, because I was reading about this film, and he really trusted Seitz to, he trusted his judgment. He said, and he has a vision, but at the same time, it's like, he works with someone that can facilitate his vision in a way that the writing is the heart of the picture, and he can let the cinematographer kind of, I feel like much more than some directors that are visionary, where they see the vision. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Sometimes the screenplay doesn't have to play as much a part.
Right.
But yeah.
And sometimes, I was always, Andrew Sarris had this whole thing about the auteur theory, and I was I took very much umbrage with the fact that he said that Billy Wilder fell outside of that, and it's there's no, yes, he doesn't, it's not like Hitchcock where it's he makes Hitchcock movies, but a Billy Wilder movie.
I revisit The Lost Weekend all the time because it's a masterful film. He's doing things in that will be done later in the 50s and 60s by Cassavetes. There's a visual style in it that is very influential.
Right. Well, and the whole thing when he goes into the dry tank and he's trying to get cured, and he sees the bat.
Oh,
And
God.
that's
There's-
train spotting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And what about the trench coat? You know, the trench coats with the bottle that become the showgirls become the trench coats with the bottle. I mean, there's so many experimental things in it that you really have to. I think of a lot of the work of Discreet Charm, Buñuel. Makes me think of Buñuel.
Yeah.
That kind of like fantasy, and to be able to, and you didn't really see that in a lot of his other films. They were pretty straightforward.
Right.
So to experiment in that film took a particular kind of just trust in what needed to be done. You know.
And he's always at the he always wanted to push the envelope as to what is like, just take a taboo subject and just explore it. Like with that, it was alcoholism.
Right.
With Double Indemnity, it's like, you know, it's pretty much one of the first film noirs.
Right.
And people look at that and be like, and say like, oh, this was the first film that kind of really took a seedy underbelly of murder and revenge and all that stuff. Infidelity. You know, with this film, it's like, you know, really peeking behind the curtain, a dark curtain of Hollywood.
I mean, when I was reading about its reception, it's like Louis B. Mayer literally berated him in front of everyone there, and reportedly took it to the point where he was like, they're both Jewish, he's like, you should go back to Germany or whatever. And he had lost his whole family to the Holocaust. It's like, where it's like, you know, it's just, it's crazy to think about you know, how much risk he took to basically put it on the line and say, this is how it is. I mean, the level of detail that went into each part of the film as to, I think the apartment complex that William Holden was living in was where struggling writers lived. And it was like, they really took the time to make it as natural as possible, which you can feel when you're watching it.
And it feels, like none of it feels like this is just a cooked up story. Like as like theatrical as it may seem. You know, I would have thought like Norma Desmond, you know, her performance is such, it's amazing because you would think it's like, oh, this is really like over the top.
Right, like Bette Davis, you think of that, but then you realize there's way more going on. It's very personal for her. When you read about how close it was to her own life, it's really a revelation to think about.
Yes.
You know,
and there's always a moment where it's like he always rides this line. Like Jack Lemmon's performance in The Apartment is the same thing. It's like, you know, God, if he just goes a little bit to the left, and it's, you know, it's a farcical performance, and if he goes a little bit to the right, and it's like, well, it's too heavy.
I was reading about how they were hesitant to screen it for Hollywood, so they started in like Evanston, Illinois, Poughkeepsie, and Great Neck. And in each one, the original opening was a morgue where the corpses were all talking to each other, and then Joe Gillis's corpse starts telling them the story. The first theater, people laughed, and then it happened all three initial screenings. And so they changed the opening to what it was, which is, it just goes, you know, and I think they were probably wary of how is this film going to resonate with Hollywood audiences, and so that kept them from immediately, but thank God they changed that opening, because it's one of the best openings ever. I mean, top 5. It's iconic. It's amazing.
And I always, like that shot of him in the pool is such a bravura shot.
Did you read about how they came up with it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's unbelievable, man.
And it's seamless. Like, you don't look at it and be like, oh, I know how it's done, so it loses its power. No, it's still there.
I was reading about Ebert's comments on the film, and he said it's the best movie about movies because it. The actual quote is that it's because it sees through the illusions. And then it occurs to me that the first shot is an illusion. Right? So it's like, I don't know, something about like the connection of those two things was big for me. So it's like, this means a lot to different filmmakers because it really just dealt with filmmaking in a way.
Right.
I mean, how much it just put it all out there.
And I think like it's not, it rides this great line where it like, there's never a moment where you feel like this is too inside baseball where like, no one's not going to get it.
Right, that's a good point.
You know, like if you are into filmmaking and you're into it, sure, you get a little bit more,
Right.
but if you're not, you understand every emotional point that it's hitting.
Richard, there's this great Richard Corliss quote. He says it's the definitive Hollywood horror movie because the story is narrated by a dead man whom Norma first mistakes for an undertaker, while most of the film takes place in an old dark house that only opens its doors to the living dead, and then compares Norma to Dracula, which I thought was just so astute. It's like, wow, how did you see it in that framework? Because it's so true.
Well, and you know, and that goes back to Billy Wilder just being a writer first, because there's a point where you can say, well, what is Sunset Boulevard? Like, what type of movie is it? Is it a horror movie? Is it a black comedy? Is it a Hollywood satire? Is it, you know, is it this? Is it that? Is it a film noir?
Well, that's we've been talking about this week to week. It's the unclassifiability of some of these auteurs, where it's like, no, they just understand the medium so well that it's effortless for them.
Right.
And they work with all amazing people. Like all these films, you just look down the line, and it's like everyone involved is amazing. Dreyer is one of the ones I was reading about, the set design. He took a lot of people that worked on silent films and like cut their teeth in the silent era.
Yeah.
There was a concerted effort to make it feel, you look at Buster Keaton and all Hedda Hopper and everyone involved. It's like he wants this to be so true, you know, to the point where it's like so effusively true. It's like it's almost like, wow, like it almost becomes cinema verite at a point. Right. You know what I mean? It's like a film noir embedded in a cinema verite because of the closeness of the proximity to the star and the filmmaker and how he got his start.
And the feelings that it brings up. Like, this is really, I just thought of this, but this is really interesting that, you know, with Chinatown, we talked about how, you know, it's very easy. It's Jack Nicholson's movie, so it's very easy to kind of fall into, we're seeing it through his eyes, we're so identifiable with his character. But it's only when you say, let's watch it through Faye Dunaway's eyes.
Right.
And with this, it's like, it's so easy to fall into William Holden's dilemma.
Right.
But if you watch it through Norma's eyes, it's so tragic and it's so harsh.
You know, there are all these clues as to how it's just not going. You know, how it's not really going well, and he's kind of suckered into. First he says, I wondered what a handwriting expert would make of that childish scrawl of hers, which is like a Hitchcock moment. It's like, oh, okay, that's a little foreshadowing that she may not be stable.
Right.
And then he says he felt kind of pleased with the way he'd handled the situation. It's just like, this guy's doomed.
Right.
There's no, you know, and we know it, right?
Yes.
We're literally given that information, but then I love the pacing of the film.
And how it reveals itself, and how it, like, there's like that moment. It's like, oh my God, he thinks he's playing her, but she's definitely playing him.
It's so great.
And that, like, the New Year's Eve party, and the dance, and like when he realizes, like, oh my God, like how did I let you think of this? And it's like, you did it the whole time.
Right. You know, von Stroheim, too. The casting. This film's casting was amazing that they pulled it off with DeMille. But von Stroheim's character, that is one of the strongest points of the film, based on the fact that they did work together and that it's so
ex-husband.
True. Oh, it's insane.
Yeah.
To think about. And, just really...
You talked about great lines and not letting any of them leave here without saying them. But it was a great big white elephant of a house, the kind crazy movie people made in the crazy 20s.
Oh God, yeah.
And then there's allusions to Great Expectations, and you know, it's so great because his character is a writer. He can have flourishes like that.
Right.
He speaks like that, and you're like, oh, I buy it because he's a writer. He's writing his
like
narration.
Purple prose, right? And it's just like, one of the great. You talk about the house. It's its own character, without a doubt.
Yeah.
The whole place seemed to have been stricken with a kind of creeping paralysis, out of beat with the rest of the world, crumbling apart in slow motion. I mean, that's like Norman Mailer. It's beautiful prose. It's out of a novel. It's amazing. There's 2 or 3 moments of that in the film where you just like, this is just classic writing. You know, it transcends a screenplay, in my opinion. It becomes literary.
It is without a doubt one of the greatest films ever made, I think. And it's hard because with Billy Wilder, it's like, you know, how many people have 2 masterpieces, maybe 3 masterpieces? And this guy pretty much has 5 or 6.
Right, he's probably got 6 or 7.
And you know, and it's hard. It's like, you know, am I in the comedy with a capital K mood with Some Like It Hot, or am I in the the deep, dark?
I felt really alienated by 1, 2, 3. There was something about it, and I like Cagney. There was something about it that was so just like over the top and showy and like not in like a comfortable, stylized sort of way that I've really found alienating.
Right.
So I'd have to go back and watch that again. But it does seem to be towards the end he was trying a little harder. Although I think Private Life of Sherlock Holmes was pretty well received. I feel like he did have hits towards the end. He's still making contact. It may not be what he was doing, but how do you know, maintain that level?
And it's hard because the great irony of him is that he was so great at pushing the boundaries within a system and within a studio that put all these limitations on him. Like, he couldn't go so far.
Did you read this story about how they pretended it was a film called A Can of Beans? It's amazing. No, they literally lied. We're like, hey, they would send them like a little bit at a time, and then they're like, it's for this. And that's how they let them do it.
Wow.
And then they didn't even have a finished script. They had a third of a script when they started shooting because of that. I mean, it's maverick filmmaking because he has suffered so much tragedy in life and manages to make these feel-good movies sometimes where it's like, how do you do this when you have that kind of past?
Right.
But then it's like he's taking risks and doing it in a way that the fact that he pulled this off at all is amazing. With how much he seemed to have to, because of the code. I was reading because of the code, basically the Breen code. He had to withhold a lot of what was going to be happening. You know, I don't know. It's just amazing. I can't imagine working within the context of that and wanting to actually represent something truthful.
Right.
You know,
and still finding a way to do it, but amazing. Just he was just very, very sly and just very like that, that sardonic wit of his, and those lines that just,
Well, the screen, it feels like a play. It has an understanding of character and and just what happens in the film is so, the way he when it gets like the flat and has to turn it into the driveway.
Yep.
It's just, I don't know, the way it all happens is just
right. He's so good at plotting his films.
Yes.
Like, the reason why this is happening is because of this, and this leads to this and that. And
I mean, he sets it up beautifully.
And it all leads, like, he's got some deal with the devil where in all of his films, every moment leads and dovetails into this perfect ending. He's the king of perfect endings.
I mean, it's incredible. This is one of the best endings ever. I mean,
it's horrifying.
It is.
Like, truly horrifying. Where she is, where she goes. And two things that because there was always a moment where I'm like, well, it's very, as a kid in college, it's like, it's one of the greatest movies ever made. I know this, but, it stops just short of being caricature and being a little cartoonish at times.
It does.
But there was two moments, like when she goes to visit Cecil B. DeMille and drives onto the lot.
Yeah.
And by the way, like that whole sequence, it's like, like in Taxi Driver when he takes her to the porno theater, and the whole time you're just like, oh God, this is the most embarrassing thing ever.
Yeah.
That's what that moment feels like to me. And there's a couple of beats where it's like she drives up and the guy's like, you can't drive, and
Right,
like,
right.
and then she notices
She
someone,
sees the guy,
and
yeah.
he comes over, and she's just like,
Teach
you know,
him some manners.
right, and you know, don't worry,
And
Norma
don't you feel good for her in that scene?
I do, but there's also like it's like. It's
You
like
feel
now
okay.
the studios are being run by people who do not know movies, do not know film history, do
Right.
not know where they've come from.
And she has this vindication during the following scenes where, you know, the light guy says,
Hello, Hawkeye.
you know, and everyone's like, Norman Desmond, you know, and then it's almost like, was that real? And there's almost a sense of that Buñuel
Yes.
presence where you're like, wait, and then I'm going to mention Blue Velvet because there's without a doubt Blue Velvet was inspired by this.
Yes.
But and Buñuel, he's a student of Buñuel, and apparently so is Wilder, because there is a sense of where you're just feeling like, wait a minute, are we? Because then I read about Waxman, and he apparently, just to segue into music here, he apparently would make distorted versions of classic film scores from the 20s and 30s to reflect her state of mind. Like, what?
Oh, that is crazy.
Like, that's just amazing. Like, how are you doing that in 1950? I mean, that's where you've got to look at it as being more important than the sum of its parts. Because to be honest, I watched it, and I'm not going to say I was underwhelmed, but something was like, okay, yeah. And I took all my notes, but it was only afterwards that I really started to connect the dots and say, no, there's so much more going on than what we're seeing. And that's when you look up all this kind of stuff, it's like, wow, they really did so much to ensure that this was the real article and that this is, take it from what you will kind of thing.
Right.
It's, you know?
Right. You know, you mentioned Lynch and Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive as well. And I always thought that like it would be, you know, a killer double feature to see Sunset
Well, see,
Boulevard.
because I can't help but think of Isabella Rossellini as the Norman Desmond character, and then even the Laura Dern as the Nancy Olsen. Of like, you know what I mean? Like, nice, the one he should be with on the outside looking in at this psychotic episode. Right? Is it not?
Oh my God, you just blew my mind, man. Because I always felt like you know, we talked Chinatown being able to call it a perfect film. There was a point where I was like, I want to be able to call this a perfect film, but with the Nancy Olsen character, I was like, oh, you know what? That might be a little too much.
I love it because he's sleeping with his. Did they end up sleeping together? I can't remember.
Well, if they did, they wouldn't be.
They were
able to
falling
say
in
it.
love. They were falling in love. He's fallen in love with his friend's fiance.
Right.
Like, what a cool. Go. You finish your point.
No. Well, I thought her performance was a little too cutesy and a little too oh gosh darn.
See, I really liked it.
But now I know like that is there for a purpose.
Betty
to make
Schaefer.
Her...
Do you know how hard it is to remember character names? That is Betty Schaefer, and I believe it. I'm telling you, I don't remember names from some movies I've watched like throughout my life, and it's like I remember her because I believe that first moment you're introduced to them, man, is like a Hawks moment. Where she's like, oh, that one,
right?
And when he pitches the baseball movie, and then she comes in and she disses it, and it's just great writing,
right?
And it's such a great, and that's really the seed that gets planted of their romance.
And the moment at the party when they start reciting lines to each other.
Oh, the scene! Come on, the scene where they're this close to each other's mouths. I mean, it's like. And the door keeps getting open, and it's like, I mean, that's just great. That's a Wilder moment. I think you could classify these moments as, there's so many moments in The Apartment that are very similar, where they're preserved in time. He endows scenes with so much humanity, it's like, it's otherworldly, if you think about it, his ability to write how people talk.
Right. And you always see the scene from, there's two different perspectives, because at first you're like, oh, it's really cute and it's really romantic, but then
you think about it
like
from Jack Webb's perspective, it's like, you know,
that's my girl, man.
It's interesting. It would definitely, you know, really makes his character more complex, and not one-dimensional. And I think that's honestly why they did it. They didn't want him to be just a cipher through which you see Norma Desmond.
One little aside, just in that scene. Because he ends that scene by saying life can be beautiful. And James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause says that. and he did it like he was mimicking William
Interesting.
Holden from Sunset Boulevard because he loved William Holden so much. Just one
That's
little.
interesting. I also read that Rebel Without a Cause used the same house as the exterior of this house.
Yep.
So it's interesting that that also. And so we should talk about William Holden because his performance was great. But to read how many people almost played it is, and in both parts. I read that Mae West and Brando were the first two choices, and then they wanted Fred McMurray, and then Montgomery Clift signed a contract, but then was like, he backed out because he thought, check this out, he thought it was too close to his role in The Heiress, and he didn't think he was convincing in that role. Like, The Heiress is one of the best films of all time,
Right.
so, and your performance was one of the best things about it, so maybe you had a insecurity problem, but you were incredible. You know what I mean? So, and then when he apparently, and so basically, there's this Wilder quote where he says, if he was any kind of actor, he'd be able to be convincing with any. Well, it was just a great, just how no nonsense he was, and why Wilder worked so well with a guy like Lemon.
Right.
When you hear about Lemon's reactions to Pacino on the set of Glengarry Glen Ross,
Right.
where it's like meat and potatoes. What are we doing here? We're making a movie, right? Which really cuts through a lot of that,
And sometimes
excess.
you get it from this book,
Really?
and sometimes it is like it's a little disheartening because you want him to be like with the fact that he wrote Ball of Fire.
God, that's
co-wrote by
it's one of my
Ball
favorite
Fire.
movies of all time.
Absolutely, and you watch it and you're like, you know what, this is a Wilder film. Like it's plotted like a Wilder film.
He has a knack for dialogue. I mean, it's amazing. It's so memorable.
When I was volunteering at the Lake Placid Film Festival, I was basically kind of like a gopher, just doing like little odd jobs here and there. And they're like, oh, you have to go and pick up this woman at this time, at this place. And I'm like, okay. So I go. I end up being 15 minutes early. I go to the front desk and ring for her. And then, someone wants to talk to you. And it's like her, handler or whatever. She's like, why are you 15 minutes early? And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I misjudged. Like, I just, I wanted to beat traffic, but, there wasn't much. So here I am, just like, well, she doesn't have her face on yet. So you can sit in the lobby until we're ready. So I'm like, all right. And she comes down, and it's like total, like she's in her own world, in the way she's talking, in the way that she handles me, handles her handler, drives, and then like I let her out, and she just kind of like flows into the scenery, and I watched her like try to mingle with some people, and getting shut out. Like I saw that happen. And then she found someone that she could relate to, and she ended up just staying there for like the whole time.
Right.
I just saw that all happen. And then when I like watch this movie, I'm like, oh, like I know what that is.
Well, that's like the set, the Cecil B. DeMille set.
When like
is at first it's really awkward. There's the guy who's blatantly just talking about smack about her,
right,
and eventually she's able to find that, but.
And it's so perfect that it's the car. Because with him, that's what led.
There's all these Easter eggs too that I didn't know about, but then I read that the bed that looks like a boat was actually owned by a popular dancer of the time who died in like 1920, and then it went to auction, and it was bought by like one of the studios like prop departments, and then it was in the Lon Chaney Phantom of the Opera. So like Wilder's just he's like Tarantino before Tarantino, of like Hollywood like nerd. Like I'm going to use all this stuff, whether you know it or not. And the person that knows Phantom of the Opera is like, that's the same bed. The person that knows, this or that, it's like really like, I don't know, really.
Well, he used to be, he wanted to be a journalist, and he
Right.
was.
In Berlin, right?
Yep. Yeah. And, you know, and I have to think like the research that he must have done, but, you know, because he's no nonsense, he's not going to, like, you know,
Right.
talk about it or like make any big thing about it. But it's just, it's all right there. Like, there's so many details.
He's like Kubrick in the sense that here's the screenplay,
Yep.
but behind it, here's the truth. Here's what he learned.
Mm-hmm.
The screenplay is just a mosaic. It's how you interpret what that person learned, right? That's the thing. It's like it's just literally what made it onto the painting. But if you think about what informed it, it's like, wow, like he really wanted this to be a testament to how he felt about that point in time.
And it's only the type of thing that an outsider or someone who immigrated here to America sees America.
Well, it's like Chinatown, man. That's the reason. Remember we talked about Evan saying, "Oh, I want this cynical point of view to really steer this a certain way," you know.
And he's got that. And talking about William Holden, like, he's just the perfect, like, this movie and Stalag 17.
Yeah. Network.
Even a little bit in Sabrina
yeah.
and The Bridge on the River Kwai. Like, he's just the perfect American, cynical.
He's great.
Smart-mouthed, you know, laissez-faire.
Counterfeit trader. I mean, he's got his filmography is pretty trustworthy to just watch his films.
Yeah.
To be honest, he didn't really do a lot of duds.
Mm-hmm. I think he's amazing. Like, he can play the romantic moments. He can play the downtrodden, down on his luck moments.
And this was one of the best uses of voiceover narrative in any film ever. Right? Because it works in concert with the music too. They both kind of help narrate the film.
Yep. It's like music, and it informs so much. Like, he's got this. So in this book, he has Wilder's top 11 tips for writers, and one of them is, be careful when you use voiceover narration. Make sure you're not telling them what the audience already sees. Make sure it adds to what the audience is seeing. And he does that. Like, it's a flavor, it's a spice on the film.
Right.
Like, it's not. And so many times, like, you hear, like, you know, don't. It's a shortcut. It's a crutch for a writer. But him and Kubrick had that way of using it in just the perfect way.
Because when you hear a great line in a voiceover, your reaction is great line.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the thing is you're revealing a way of thinking for the character or a way of reflecting. That when it's not the writer talking, but the character talking, that's when it's effective. But if you feel like, oh, this is just a lazy way to relate information, that's when it's like, maybe you shouldn't do that.
It really isn't ever telling you a plot point. It really just is, like,
Right.
you know.
What does he say? I always wanted a pool. Well, I finally got one, but the price was pretty high. However he says, you know, it's like, that's just a great line. It's one of the first in the film.
And that shot, to start,
It's
to
amazing.
have so much confidence in yourself as a
Does
director,
it
as a
not have,
filmmaker.
does it not have the wizardry of like a Salvador Dali, like Buñuel moment when she and Andalou, or what he did in Spellbound with Hitchcock?
Yep.
It's really like very like, whoa, am I really seeing, like, what am I seeing? And I didn't even realize it. That's how good of an illusion it is. You just feel like, of course the camera's under the water.
Right.
There's no way it's not. Right? Why would you think that there's a mirror? You know, I mean, it's phenomenal.
And he's always, like, he's got a couple of moments in this book where he says, you know, he'll call out someone doing some tricky shot. And he's like, well, yeah, it's a nice shot, but what does it have to do with anything in the movie? It has no story point whatsoever. And when you think of Wilder, you don't normally think of, like, big cinematography.
We talked about Rio Bravo, where those shots that reminded us, you know, of Hitchcock or whatever, were very much part of the story.
Right.
Real quick, I want to talk about Gloria Swanson's Chaplin impersonation and how just amazing it is, and just like this pop-up like thing for us to enjoy.
Yep.
And also Wilder's reaction to Seitz says, "Hey, so how do you want me to set up this like this chimpanzee funeral?" And he says something like, "You know, your standard monkey funeral shot." It's like, that's just his sense of humor.
It's
Is
incredible.
dry and just amazing, right? Of course, he said that to him, right? Like, it's just, yeah. He talked how he wrote, right?
Right.
I mean, he was
Right.
that guy.
Right.
Ugh.
We enter her character in her castle with a funeral for a monkey. it's
It's pretty, like, almost allegorical. Like, you could, like, literally, like, break down what
Like-
each thing means.
that's a Lynch moment.
Absolutely.
Like, you know,
It shows, like, kind of like a twisted sense of humor, or like a, I want to throw in this red herring.
Right.
To try to, like, make people, you know, I mean, it's just, it's absurdist theater, you know?
and the way, like, you know, you'll wake the chimp
Right.
when he says that. I mean,
I love what Von Stroheim, he goes, "You're not dressed appropriately for the occasion." I was like, what's the occasion? It's just, that is Lynch style writing. I mean, wow, I never thought about the potential influence of Wilder on Lynch. And it's not until you revisit certain films that you start to
Right.
realize,
right.
you know, you're seeing the same.
Because when he was at his darkest, when Wilder was at his darkest and nastiest, you know, with Lost Weekend and with this, like, those are the two films where he goes to these surreal moments and these just completely off the wall visuals and details that, as wild as they seem, ring true, or you're so in tune with the story and the point that it's trying to make that you're just like, you know, never for a moment where are you like, this is crazy, like it's a chimp, like, no, I'm not going to watch
Right.
this.
Right.
You're so
If
involved.
anything, it informs you so distinctly about her character.
Like the way she has her hand on the arm of the chair, where I think it's on her knee, where it's just like crooked, like it's like Nosferatu. And she's got the little thing, the cigarette on the, and he has this great line about it where it's like, you know, I felt like I was, you know, pinched between.
Well, there's that ever-present Murnau, you know, influence, where it's just like a baseline, right? You've just got like these like 3 or 4 people at that point that people are pulling from.
That I respect him so much because he is that writer. It's like no, like okay, so he's gonna go into this house, and the house has to be, you know, it's got to be horrifying. It's got to be scary.
Right.
So, you know, let's make it like a horror movie, and let's pull all these different visuals and all these different details that
Right.
allude to that. But let us not forget, we're basing this in reality. So, you know, we can't go full, you know, German expressionism. But how can we just pull a little bit?
You know, you mentioned Taxi Driver, and there's another moment in that where we're spared the embarrassment of Travis Bickle when he's calling her, and it just won't show us his heartbreaking.
Right.
And there's a bit of that in the ending of Sunset Boulevard. We are spared her arrest. It's played out like it is allowed to play out like a scene in a film.
Because the cops are like, wait a minute, if it'll get her down the stairs.
Exactly. Which is, doesn't Von Stroheim, is that his advice, I feel
Yes.
like? It's like, you know, I mean, he gets to direct her in her final scene. It's beautifully poetic, tragic, all kinds of things.
I also love, like you would talk about, like how he perfectly plots his films and leads us. Like it's just like, you know, A, B, C, these moments all lead to the same thing.
Right.
And that the beautiful way in which the only way Joe can free himself is to break the heart of the girl that he really wants to be with and show her.
That's really tough to watch,
It's
those scenes.
you know, he's got to say, like, he's got to be like, well, there's no way I'm going to ever be with her,
Right.
because I'm never going to be free from this. So here, this is the romance that you want. Here it is. Here's where you're heading towards.
I mean, really, it's, if you think about it, like, it's just crazy to think that he's so completely in her grasp. Like, he can't like shake himself free and be like, what are you doing? Just leave.
Right.
But he feel, you know, it's what they did was they architected such a desperate set of circumstances where this is the only way he can survive. And that's why it's necessity. That's what creates the logic for that even being.
Right. And there's also a bit of it where it's like, you know, you think he's doing a horrible thing to her, but it's the only, like, he has to bring her to a level where she hates him so that she can leave him and not be heartbroken about it, not be damaged by it. She can be free. I can't free myself, I can free her. All that stuff is going on in that scene.
You know, it's also a commentary on mental illness as well. I mean, she doesn't, you know, it's like, what should von Stroheim be doing? Should he really be nursing her? When he goes, you shouldn't check the postmarks on those fan letters. It's like, is this really what you should be doing?
Right. He's just
like aiding this just delusion. What do you think's going to happen? This is going to end in tragedy. There's no moral responsibility.
And it already has, to the point where there's no locks or doorknobs on the doors.
I know.
And it's
well,
like,
and Wilder lets us know all that. It's all detailed.
Yep.
He's thought it out so much. Yeah.
And he lets it out. You know, he's so great at, like, letting the audience add up 2 + 2, because it's not like, you know, he's like, hey, there's no.
Well, because he's like Spielberg meets Buñuel meets, like, it's like, how do you exist? How are you this person who, like, hits it out of the park like 6 times? He literally has like 6 grand slams, and you're like, but you're also the guy who, like, took chances and, like, didn't care. Like, that's a realistic anomaly. You know, George Cukor is the one who told him, you should look up Gloria Swanson. And then Gloria Swanson didn't want to do a screen test. And she called Cukor, or however when they met for lunch or whatever. And she's like, is this wrong of me to, like, feel this way, that I don't want to do this? And he's like, listen, this is the role you're going to be remembered for. So you're going to screen test 100 times if they want you to screen test, or I'm going to kill you. It's like, what? That's just amazing.
Yeah. There's so many directing friends that he had, and if he would have listened to some of his friends' advice, you know, we wouldn't have the movies that we have. And, like, you know, the fact that he's a writer, it's like, you know, with this film, like, no, I'm going to do all these different things, and it's all going to make sense because my script is going to make sense. With Some Like It Hot, it's like, I'm making a comedy with a capital K. But I swear, if you start Some Like It Hot, you would think you were watching a gangster film. And then all of a sudden, it's like, I'm basing this comedy on this horrific St. Valentine's Day massacre. And I think it was William Wilder said, like, you can't make a comedy about the St. Valentine's Day massacre. They'll run you out of the streets. And he's like, no, I'm going to do it. And he does it.
You know, another thing that reveals a lot about Wilder's character is they had the original screenplay and weren't really sure about it, and brought in the third writer, who was like a Life magazine writer and had reviewed one of Wilder's films. And he, in bracket, liked the review. They really called him in. Like, what? That's just, I mean, he really wasn't scared to do whatever he needed to do. I mean, that's thinking outside the box. So you got to call a movie reviewer that reviewed your film.
Right.
Here you go. Let's work on this with me. Right. That had to be amazing for that guy. You know?
I mean, there's all these stories about when he was making The Apartment, how you know, Shirley MacLaine, I guess, was going through a really terrible breakup behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And that she would like be at lunch or, you know, somewhere, and she would just say stuff. She would just start talking. And then she'd get to the set and she'd get the pages for the day, and what she said was there. Like one of the great lines in The Apartment is, you know, why do people have to love people anyway? And she's like, I said that. Like I said that at lunch.
Well, writers are great listeners.
And that's like that journalist mind. It's like, oh,
you know,
this is real.
There's a little of that in this. I was reading about the costume design and Edith Head, who, if you look at her filmography, she literally was responsible for 45 of the greatest films ever made.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing to look at. She's like the name you think of, and it's like when you look at like how she said, oh, well, this is based on Gloria Swanson's life pretty much, so I'm going to let her kind of like figure out what she kind of wants to, but she said she wanted to make her look like someone who was always impersonating someone else.
Oh my God.
And then Wilder said he let her clothe Holden and a lot of the minor characters, but he wanted Olsen and von Stroheim to wear their own clothes so that it was more just realistic. And I mean, just that kind of detail. It's like there wasn't anything spared.
I know what Vicuna is because of this movie, and like that little moment where he's just like, as long as the girl's paying for it, why not get the Vicuna?
Right.
And that little like that smirk that he has, and that he's just like,
well, and that's a whole nother subtext is Joe losing his self-respect. So it's like the death of Joe before the death of Joe. I mean, he's just completely. He almost opened himself up to something like this, because it's like, take control of your life, man. Get out of here. And there is a glimpse of that when that gets said to him. He kind of looks at him like, is this really what my life has become?
right.
But then he still allows it to happen.
But just a lot of great moments, and like when he's trying to write the script, and then he takes the pages and he throws them in the trash, and she comes over and is like, what are you doing? And it's like, no, you know, it's superfluous. Like, you don't need those pages. It's better to just cut from that to that.
Right.
And just like, cut away from me? How dare you? It's just like, put it back.
Well, and then you know, to find out that the movie she shows was actually a Gloria Swanson movie, I believe directed by von Stroheim.
Yep.
Called Queen Kelly. Just like to find, you know, there's all these little just like unspoken.
And those are the types of like art imitating life, life imitating art moments that, you know, you don't really get in many movies around this time.
Just the nature of the project that allowed for such a truly just, you know, dense kind of piece of work where you could truly unravel it like that, you know?
It really is like one of my...
How many times have you seen it? Because this is only my second time.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
This is one of those for you where
Yeah.
you've gone back.
Like that, I was just so in love with him during college,
Right.
and his work, and just like, you know, it was that lamp in the distance. Like I kept watching his movies,
Right.
and it's weird. Like I still haven't, you know, there's still ones that I haven't seen that I'm
Same
like
here.
I'm waiting on. Like
There's a
Five
lot
Graves to Cairo.
I've
I
never
want to
seen
see
that, and the other one that's the early one.
A Foreign Affair.
Yeah,
Yeah.
haven't seen that either. So.
I'm like waiting for those two, but I remember like, you know, it's like with Hitchcock. It's like there's those 4 or 5 that everyone talks about,
Right,
but
right.
then there's the 5 that no one talks about, and when you discover them, like that was Stalag, like the Stalag 17. Like I just caught it on AMC one day, and I'm watching it, and my dad comes in, he starts watching it, and my mom comes in at a certain point and starts watching it, and I'm like, I was there from the beginning, just watching the whole thing. And at the end of the movie, we're talking about these perfect endings. Like at the end of the movie, there's a moment that it drives to of a character whistling, and it was one of those moments where it's like I wanted to start crying just because I'm like, I know I just saw a perfect movie, and I now know what a perfect movie is,
Wow.
and I just have to keep steering towards that.
Yeah.
His movies, like the first time I saw Ace in the Hole, and just being like,
Oh, God.
holy crap!
How have we not mentioned that movie?
And he did it right after this. He's like, no, I didn't get nasty enough. I'm gonna go right to the heart.
I'm a huge Kirk Douglas fan, and I think about 10 of his pictures are 10 of the best movies ever made.
Yep.
He was like Nicholson in that regard, where he knew what in that period where he just could do no wrong.
Oh my God! At the end, when he's talking, when he goes up and he's talking to everyone, he's like, the circus is over.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great screenplay. Yeah.
That movie is.
I like Detective Story too. I always thought those would be good, Wilder and Wilder double bills, and Douglas double bills,
Yep. His movies were, to me, were just like, and they became the movies that with friends and with Robin, it's like, oh, you've got to see these movies,
Right.
like this, and you better like them because I don't know. But no, I mean, I still to this day there's never been a person that I've met that I've introduced The Apartment to that didn't fall in love with The Apartment.
I mean, if you look at Double Indemnity, Lost Weekend, The Apartment, Some Like It Hot, Sunset Boulevard, those are 5 of the best films ever made. Mm-hmm. And I think the rest, then you could start really. I know there's people who, like yourself and others, who say Stalag 17 is
Yep.
I just think with those 5, it's like undeniable.
Right.
Right. They're literally just flawless films.
Mm-hmm.
You can't.
And every one of them has a William Holden in the pool moment. Because in Double Indemnity, it's like that he lands on that close-up of Barbara Stanwyck when her husband's being murdered. And he just stays there. And he knew, that's all I need. I don't need anything else. I don't need all this fancy shadow work. Right. I just need her. Ace in the Hole, it's him falling into that close-up. Some like It Hot, God, the swish pan sequence. And it's a Scorsese moment before a Scorsese happened. And on and on and on and on. He knew. One, I respect him as a writer because it was it was one of the first filmmakers that I was introduced to and fell in love with, where it's like, oh no, it started with the script, and I now know that it starts with a script. Mm-hmm. But then it was just, he just knew how to bring it to life in such a way. It's not like John Ford, where it's like, well, he does his John Ford thing, and right. I know what that is. It's like with Billy Wilder, it's like there's something so elusive about it that he's just like, from movie to movie, it's like, oh, I can't pin you down. I don't know exactly what you do, but I know what you do. And I love, I romanticize, this damn picture here. I want that hat. I want the sunglasses. I want, that's what I think of when I think of directing. Wow. I'm crazy about them.
I mean, I understand. When I was at World of Video, I would get really enamored of a certain filmmaker, and then I would just disappear down that rabbit hole. And I'll tell you, I ripped off like 12 in a row. Mm-hmm. It's just, I mean.
And I also love that he's like, I'm nothing. Go see a Lubitsch film. That's something. Like Lubitsch, I guess, was his mentor. And there's a famous, in his office, he had a famous sign above his typewriter that said, how would Lubitsch do it? That I love. And, and you go back to those Lubitsch pictures, and there's that mysterious Lubitsch touch that he has.
It's true.
And he's got the same thing.
There's a little of Buñuel and Lubitsch, if you think about it. Because the fact that Buñuel was doing what he did so early mm-hmm. was like, whoa, this guy's more imaginative than anyone, So of course people are going to draw from it. But Lubitsch was almost, it's like he could do what Wilder ended up doing, but in his own way.
Right.
Which was like, oh, I can do like a Cirque kind of film, but it's going to be weird. It's going to be like, right. like really ethereal and just seem weird, which But then Wilder's got this kind of, it's just the journalist in him. He's like, you know, I want to give you something that really feels like you're like eating a sandwich, but you didn't realize what was on the sandwich.
Right.
It's
Right.
kind of-
Right.
right?
I love that he's not able to be classified. You know, Andrew Sarris be damned. Like I can't call The Apartment a romantic comedy. You just can't. You know, you can't call this a Hollywood satire because it's so much more. And there's so many different levels to it. You know, I mean, what is Ace in the Hole? You know, Double Indemnity. It's a film noir, but is it?
Right.
Because a film noir didn't exist before it happened. Like, you know, he was just making a story. He just had this character and he had this scenario, and he just followed that. You know, the same with this. It's like I want to get at the underbelly of Hollywood. So okay, so I want to get. It's got to be a writer, because like he says in the movie, nobody thinks a writer writes this stuff. They just think the actors make it up as they go along. So I gotta look at that unsung hero.
Oh, and there's so many kind of bitter lines in the movie where she, you know, he says, I don't want you to think that I think I'm going to get nominated for an Oscar for this. She goes, well, why don't you write, paraphrasing, but like, why don't you write something from the heart, or what you feel passionate. Goes, I'm trying to make a living.
Right.
Right. And there's all, you know, there's all these sort of like hints at how he felt boxed in.
Right.
You know?
Or and he's like he's like a message kid.
Right.
Just a story won't do.
There's a great Gone with the Wind quote.
Yep.
He goes, no, that was me. I said, who's going to go see a Civil War picture?
Right.
I mean, and the humor does work.
And again, like that's a perfect example of, like, you know, not being so inside baseball. It's like, you know, because if you know,
everyone knows Gone with the Wind.
right?
Yeah.
You know, you can laugh at, like, you know, it's funny for someone who makes movies. It's funny in a certain way, and more of a way. For someone, just a casual film goer, it's like, that's funny because, you know, I know that Gone with the Wind is one of the most, you know, successful
and it
pictures of all
informs
time.
you about that guy's character. It's like, oh, he's the guy who passed on the, you know, one of the greatest films ever made. It's like, it's just a great, it's not, and that's what's great about when humor is utilized that way, because he's not trying to have some big punchline. It's also informing you about the character. So it's just a great script because it's not one-dimensional at all.
It's also a little Barton Fink in this.
I hadn't thought about that. Absolutely. Old Hollywood, the limitations. If you think about he's about the wrestler, right? Or is it the boxer or the wrestler?
Wrestler.
It's wrestler. And it's very much like the baseball film. I mean, without a doubt. Yeah.
And
the futility of being that kind of writer at that time.
And, like, you know, the ending, like him on the beach being lost in that painting is like Norma Desmond coming down the stairs being lost in.
Yeah. Wow.
For God's sakes, if you haven't seen Sunset Boulevard, see Sunset Boulevard. There is so much there, as we have talked about. You know, it's one of those movies where, especially, you know, if you're someone who, you know, doesn't necessarily think you like old movies or don't think you like black and white movies, this is one of those movies that you will watch and go, oh my God, I can't believe they made this back in 1950. And if you're a David Lynch fan, if you're a Coen Brothers fan, if you're a Buñuel fan, then you're going to see influences within this film. So please see it and then follow the Billy Wilder rabbit hole, because it is an amazing place to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Everything he just said.
All right, so very exciting. Next week we are going to be talking about King Kong, but we're also on Tuesday going to be screening King Kong at Main Street Landing. It's a free screening. It's July 3rd, so we're going to watch King Kong, and then we're going to go out and watch the fireworks on Burlington waterfront. So if you're around, please join us, and please see one of Hollywood's first spectacles on the big screen. And we'll see you next time.